But you got away.
I got away, yes.
What did you do?
It's a rather long story. It took me 2 months to get over to Sweden. I started swimming.
In that cold water?
Yes, it was extremely cold.
Have you ever come across a story that stirred something so deep within you, you were compelled to do something about it? You know, one of those stories that's full of danger, excitement, thrilling chases, disaster and elation. Sometimes we must look to the past in order to see our future. A strong sense of inspiration can be found in the accolades of our predecessors. As a boy, I read a book that had such a profound impact on my life. It would inspire me to later retrace its roots when I stumbled upon it once more 26 years later. My journey to retrace World War II's greatest survival story took me all the way to the Arctic Circle, on a journey back in time where I discovered just how incredible this true story really was. However, much of what I filmed in the Arctic got damaged by the cold and wasn't usable. So I decided I'd use some archive footage from film and interviews to tell the story of the man with 9 lives. The tragic story of Operation Martin and the incredible survival of Jan Boelsrud at great cost is legendary in Norway. It inspired 3 books and was even made into an Oscar-nominated Norwegian film. However, outside of Norway, it's very little known. And that's such a shame because it is such an amazing story, and true at that. To tell the story properly, we need to go back to the start. Back to 1940 and the invasion of Norway itself, with the decimation of the poorly trained Norwegian army. After the invasion, some soldiers managed to get away and they escaped to Scotland. Here in Scotland they regrouped and they were spurred on to form a new Norwegian army, one that began learning elite soldiering so that they could repel the German forces from their homeland. They began training as commandos. Norwegian Independent Company No. 1 was formed in March of 1941 under the command of Martin Linge. The unit would become more affectionately known as Kompani Linge because of its founder's name. It was also one of the most successful and highly decorated units of the war, carrying out operations such as archery, grouse, and of course the infamous Gunnerside, where the heroes of Telemark destroyed the heavy water production in northern Norway that could have actually resulted in a Nazi atomic bomb. Jan Boelsrud joined Kompani Linge in the spring of 1942, having escaped Norway, arriving in London via South America. Along the way to London, Jan met fellow Norwegian Per Blindheim, who had also escaped Norway via South America, and the two became great friends. In London, Jan and Per found themselves at Piccadilly Circus, where they bumped into a familiar English officer whom Jan had known in Stockholm. This man recruited both into Kompani Linge, bringing them to Achnacarry in Scotland, the birthplace of the commandos and the template for every Special Forces unit known today. In Scotland, Kompani Linge trained hard to prepare for top secret missions of resistance and sabotage all over their homeland. Jan Boelsrud and Per Blindheim were chosen for a special mission type never before attempted. These men were to undertake a mission of sabotage and resistance training in Arctic Bardufoss, where the Luftwaffe were destroying PQ convoys bringing vital supplies to the Eastern Front in Russia. There were of course many missions launched into southern Norway. However, none had ventured so far north before. Intel about Arctic Norway wasn't as good as southern Norway, but the Special Operations Executive thought this kind of mission in Bardufoss was still feasible. First Lieutenant Sigurd Eskeland was once a postman in the mission theatre, so he was chosen to lead the mission. Second Lieutenant Jan Bulsrud was from Oslo, further south. He was 2IC, second in command. Together with Sergeants Per Blindheim and Gabriel Salveson, they were joined by Special Operations Executive Agent Erik Reichelt on board a small Norwegian fishing boat named the Brattholm. The Brattholm was crewed by Captain Kvernhellen and his 6 Norwegian sailors, and they were to take the commandos and the agent to latitude 70 degrees north and then return to the Shetland Islands with the boat. Erik Reichelt was an SOE spy, and his job was to organise and manage the link between the resistance network in Tromsø and the saboteurs' operations. Indeed, Reichelt had earlier visited the city of Tromsø to establish contact with the resistance leaders, organising funds, safe houses, and gathering intelligence on Gestapo forces in the area in 1942. The thing is, Tromsø was actually the Gestapo's HQ in northern Norway, so these operations and activities were very, very risky. Kvernhellen and his men set sail from the Shetland Islands, transporting the commandos, the spy, and 8 tons of explosives back home to Norway and latitude 70 degrees north, 300 miles inside the Arctic Circle. The original plan was to hide out on a remote island called Senja. Here, 8 tons of high explosive could be concealed easily from the enemy. And you know, this might have actually worked had the intel not let them down. You see, as the Brattholm entered the Sound for Senja Island, it was met by a German patrol boat, heavily armed and heavily armoured.
Because of this anomaly, that German patrol ship, Senja was no longer viable. The German activity was completely unexpected in the area, so they had to find somewhere else to hide the high explosives. They weren't going to abort the mission, on the contrary, they were going to push on. So they sailed further north up to the island of Ribenesøy, and up here they weighed anchor in a little bay called Toftefjord. Eskeland used to be a postman here many years before, and he seemed to remember there was a local shopkeeper that just might be able to help them. So he and Jan made a trip. As they arrived to the shop, everything looked completely normal. Same paint, same everything. Name above the door was the exact same, except the man who answered the door was completely unexpected. Yet another piece of intel that went wrong. This man was by no means the same caliber of person as the previous shopkeeper, who was now dead.
De tok han som var her før meg.
So Eskeland and Bulsrud decided that they would explain to this man what they were at and who they
Det var
were.
en mann vi kunne
They
stole
gave him a
på.
few British cigarettes, which kind of made this guy feel a little bit sick. He wasn't used to that tobacco. It was a stronger strength or something. He wasn't willing to hide the high explosives, but he said, I think I know somebody who might just do that for you. And he gave them the names of 2 fishermen on the island of Ribenesøy who would be sympathetic to their plight. As the commandos were leaving, they warned this guy, don't tell a soul of our visit. Not a word. Do not breathe a word to anyone. Understand? And this guy agreed. He said, I'll keep my mouth shut. I won't say anything to anyone. But it wasn't unusual for the Germans to have Norwegians working for them, trying to trick the ordinary population into helping Allied soldiers on the run. He actually talked to his wife about this, and she urged this guy to phone the police. And that's exactly what he did. Whilst Bulsrud and Sigurd Eskeland were off making a deal with the fishermen to hide the high explosives, the shopkeeper, the new guy, placed a phone call to the local police station. As luck had it, it arrived to 2 patriotic Norwegian policemen. They decided that they were going to try and delay the call for as long as possible, but not forever. And inevitably, they had to patch it through to the sheriff, who told the Gestapo in HQ back on Tromsø, and they dispatched that patrol ship they met earlier on, the commandos met earlier on, to pick the sheriff up and bring him to Toftefjord to investigate. And this is where everything went absolutely foobar. The German patrol ship attacks the Brattholm. Kvernhellen orders his men to immediately evacuate, to abandon ship. Reichelt and the sailors jump into a rowboat and they make for shore, chased by Nazis in another rowboat. Bulstrode, he runs up into the wheelhouse of Bratholm, sets fire to all the top secret documentation. Blindheim and Eskeland speedily run down into the belly of the Bratholm and prime a very, very long delay on the fuse connected to the high explosives, 8 tons of high explosives. Their intention is to try and sink the German patrol ship. Salvesen, he's jumped into another rowboat, he's made ready, waiting for the other guys. All 4 jump into this rowboat and wait until the last second, and then they start rowing away, expecting a big bang. As the German patrol ship nudges onto the Bratholm, there is a bang, but it's not that big, and Blindheim stands up and goes, "What the hell did fuck?" And he gets shot, and he's killed by machine gun fire from the German patrol ship. Then there is a massive explosion. The Bratholm goes up in smithereens, and the 3 remaining commandos are then tossed into the freezing cold Arctic waters. Bulstrode loses a snow boot in the process of being tossed into the water. He swims to shore anyway. Eskeland just behind and Salvesen not too far behind. Bulstrode is the strongest swimmer. He makes it to shore first. Then comes Eskeland. Grenade goes off. Yeah, potato masher just right there on the ground. Bang! Wounded in the abdomen. Drops down to the ground. Shouts up to Bulstrode, "You gotta get out of here, you gotta get out of here." And just then Salvesen's killed on the shoreline. Everyone else is captured. Bulstrode looks back down from the top of the snow gully he's just scampered up, and he sees all of his friends lying on the ground or else being captured, and he hears Eskeland screaming at him to get away. Doesn't have a choice, and he decides to start legging.
Scrambling up a gully, Bulstrode released the safety on his Colt 25 pistol. He hid behind a rock and waited. A German officer and some soldiers came scrambling up the gully. Bulstrode stepped out, took a shot, ended up shooting the officer and killing him, and then another shot, wounding a soldier. This bought him some time. Suddenly, everything had now changed. The mission was a total loss, and Jan was alone and on the run. He was missing a vital snow boot, and wounded from machine gun fire, he had lost the big toe of his left foot. He had no food or water. He was in completely unfamiliar territory, and not only that, he had 50 German soldiers on his tail. Picture yourself in that situation. You're alone in the Arctic Circle, chased by 2 platoons of German soldiers who won't think twice about killing you if they find you. You have 0 provisions, you've been betrayed by your own kind, and you've no idea how any of this will play out. What does someone do in that kind of situation? Most would probably give up, quit and die. Panic would set in. However, Bulstrode wasn't like that. He was a different kind of person altogether. He was a Norwegian commando. Giving in, surrendering, or getting captured was not an option. He had to press on. He had to get back to Scotland and regroup and make it back to Norway, where he could avenge his fallen comrades. Sadly, this isn't what fate had in store for Jan Bulstrode. Already missing his snow boot and with 1 toe shot off, he was in immense pain but had to push on. He had to put distance between himself and the chasing soldiers. This is where he made the decision to wade into the freezing cold icy waters and swim to a small rock in the middle, big enough for just 1 man. This was actually very clever, and his thinking was that the hunters would not believe anyone would swim and instead would double back around the island. After several hours of hiding out on this small little rock in the middle of the sound, the Germans had doubled back themselves, and Jan's plan worked. Thing is, he was shivering, he was frozen, his uniform had begun to freeze and become rock hard. So to warm up, he began doing exercises. He couldn't actually go back because there were still soldiers on the island, so he had to swim again, this time to a little island called Vårøya, or Spring Island. When he reached Vårøya, he was absolutely shattered. As he collapsed on the shore, he heard voices on the other side of the island. So crawling over, he saw 3 little girls walking along the beach of Hershaya, which was another island. Between the 2 islands was Wolf Sound. It was too big to swim, so Jan called to the little girls and asked for their help. But the girls were suspicious of this uniformed man at first.
Men då ropade han det. Vi stoppade ju och ro. Då ropade han på oss att kom bara igen, det är inte farligt. Ja. Det är ju strax bättre.
Eventually though, they agreed to row him over to Hershaya.
So Jan was now temporarily safe at Fru Peterson's house on Hershaya. But what of his comrades back at Toftafjord? As far as he was concerned, these men were all dead. Reality was so much worse. Of course, 2 men did die back at Toftafjord. Sergeants Per Blindheim, Jan's best friend, and Sergeant Gabriel Salvason. Reichelt, the SOE spy, Kvernhellen, captain of the Braton, and 6 sailors were captured on the shore. First Lieutenant Commando Sigurd Eskeland was also captured, wounded from grenade shrapnel in his stomach. So Reichelt and Eskeland were both taken here to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, severely wounded and exhausted. Horribly, both of them were subjected to intense and brutal torture to reveal secrets about the local resistance leaders in Tromsø. Reichelt, of course, knew who these were. He had made contact with them earlier on. But the Gestapo were more interested in another piece of intel they thought these men could give them. The German hierarchy were convinced that the Allied invasion of Europe was going to take place and begin in Norway. And for that reason, they tortured both Eskeland and Reichelt to within an inch of their lives, for secrets neither men really had at all. It's said that their spine-chilling screams made the hair stand on end of every member of staff in the entire hospital. They took Eskeland into a toilet and they severely tortured him in there, while they tortured Reichelt in his bed. Reichelt sadly died in his bed that day from the torture. Eskeland died the very next day. Captain Kvernhellen and his sailors were to face a much worse fate. They had been held and tortured at Gestapo HQ. They wouldn't have been privy to so much information as the commandos and the spy were, so it was a little bit unjust that they were tortured as severely as they were. The day after Eskeland's death, Captain Kvernhellen and his 6 sailors were made march from Gestapo HQ in central Tromsø out to a firing range called Grunåsen, a few miles outside of town. Here, the sailors and the captain were greeted by Russian POWs digging a big trench. Kvernhellen and his men were lined up, shackled to one another. German soldiers stood behind, made ready with their rifles, cocked and aimed. Order was given to fire, and a loud volley of shots rang out. Not all of the sailors died instantaneously. Some of them were only wounded. The ones who were killed dragged their wounded comrades down into the trench that was dug for them. The Russian POWs were then ordered to fill in the grave, burying these brave Norwegian men alive.
It's a lot to take in, but when missions like this go seriously wrong, they usually end in disaster, and this one was most certainly disastrous. Only 1 man had managed to get away with his life from the ambush in Toftafjord, but he was a long way from safety just yet. He knew nothing of what happened in Tromsø. However, he knew both Per and Gabriel were killed in the Sound at Toftafjord. Thing is, if he was to make it back to Scotland alive and let them know what happened, he actually had to put everything else out of his mind and focus. Because after all, this mission type was never before attempted, and German activity was supposed to be nil.
Back at Toftafjord, the Braton's high explosive may not have actually sunk the German patrol ship, but it sure as hell did blow the Braton itself to smithereens. Many years later, the helm of the Braton was recovered from the bottom of the fjord, and that helm is now located at a little museum in Furuflaten. The ambush itself in Toftafield could be seen by everybody who lived in the bay, and one family in particular was to be intricate in Jan's survival. The only thing is, they got out of Dodge. Haldis Idripson was at home alone with her children, while her husband was away in the Lofoten Islands fishing. She decided it best to get out of Dodge and take her children with her over to her sister's house on Hershaya, where Anna Pedersen was also at home alone. But her eldest son, Ingvald, was at home. It was the daughters of Haldis Idripson and Anna Pedersen who found Jan Bolsrud that night and took him by rowboat over to Hershaya and back home to Anna and Haldis. Anna Pedersen ran upstairs and she got some blankets and a spare snow boot for Jan and some old clothes that would fit him, while Haldis tended to his toe and bandaged it up. In the dead of night, Ingvald rode Jan 2 kilometres across Wolfsound to Mikkelvika and this lonesome house on Ringvassøya Island. This was the local midwife's house, Jakoba Jensen. Her husband, Herr Jensen, had a motorboat and made regular trips to mainland Troms. Jan's plan was to hitch a ride and then travel south to Sweden. But Herr Jensen had already left for Troms when Jan arrived there that night. So Jakoba offered for him to wait until he returned the next morning, saying he would gladly take him to Tromsø the next day. But birthing mothers upstairs made Jan nervous and he decided it best to leave. Jakoba gave him some food and some good advice on safe houses in the local area that he could take refuge in. Jan had studied a map of the island, but it was poorly detailed and he found it tough going, even along the coastline. And then he faced the mountains at Engenes and Karenes as he headed south to Bjørnskjær. Jan's reason for going to Bjørnskjær was because of this man, Einar Sørensen. He was a good man and also known to have helped other Allied soldiers make their way to Sweden and escape back to Scotland. But at first, the Sørensen family weren't sure if Jan was friend or foe.
Vi hade köket liksom på översidan, men så hade vi inte blänna där. Och där såg vi han kom och gick runt. Ja, man orienterade sig liksom, gick om huset för. Och vi kände ju att nu var det nog, vi visste ju om det var vän eller fiende. Så man gick då ut och luktade upp dörren, så spörde han om det Einar.
So once Einar was sure that Jan wasn't an enemy or someone trying to trick them, he went upstairs and he woke his 76-year-old father, Bernhard Sørensen. An old sea dog, even at 76 years of age, Bernhard was eager to help out and row Jan across the Sound. Their plan was to row Jan across Grötsundet to Snorrby, 8 kilometres away. The only thing is, that German patrol boat in the bay forced them to stop at a little island called Nippon, and here they feigned fishing until the stern of the patrol ship disappeared into the mist, and then they continued on and landed Jan at Snorrby on mainland Troms. Here they gave him food, some proper snow boots and a pair of skis. Jan was now heading for the Løvli farm and the Lockhartson household. So Jan was determined to get back to Scotland via Sweden, but he hadn't reckoned with the terrain he would face on mainland Troms. Up to this point, he believed he could actually ski the whole way to Sweden. But as he carefully approached the Lockhartson house, he was unaware of just how difficult this plan was going to be. As Jan approached the Lockhartson household, he opened the back door carefully, slipped inside and collapsed on the floor. Upstairs, Alfred Lockhartson heard a little bit of a commotion downstairs. So he got out of the bed without waking his wife and made his way into the kitchen, and there on the floor was this man, absolutely shattered. Lockhartson wasn't exactly sure who this man was, so he kept prodding him and kept asking him loads of questions, and he was still unconvinced as to who Jan was until he saw the shot off toe. At that point he actually relaxed and realised, look, it's not the Gestapo, I'm not being raided at this hour of the morning on Sunday. So he said, right, you can stay here until I get up in the morning, have a little bit of a sleep and decide what to do with you then. Alfred didn't sleep, of course, and the next morning he came downstairs and spoke to Jan, finding out a little bit more about who he was, and then he realised that this man had come from the tragedy in Toftafjord. Once he had reassured Jan that the Lockhartson household was a safe house, he began to tell him of the fate of his comrades. As Alfred spoke, Jan sat there in complete shock. He was absolutely mortified when he heard what had happened to his comrades. Devastated as he was, he gathered his thoughts, and then he told Alfred, "I want to ski all the way to Sweden via Ulvsfjorden." That was when Lockhartson got a little bit of a shock and said, "Hold on, Jan, I'm going to grab a map." The thing is, when you look at a map, you can get an idea of a terrain, but you can't actually get the reality. You won't know what that is until you're up front, close and personal with these mountains. So Alfred told Jan that this plan just wasn't going to work. The terrain was not passable by foot, let alone by ski. And he had a better idea. So Alfred suggested that the plan was to be changed a little because it would take weeks to get across Ulvsfjorden. And Jan didn't have weeks. Alfred went away and spoke to a friend by the name of Peter Nielsen. The plan was they were going to take Jan by boat down along the fjord and take him down to a little bay called Tittabjornsfjorden or Cowberry Bay. This was going to reduce the amount of time it would take Jan considerably. Peter Nielsen was absolutely very willing to help, so he got on board, realising that there was an amount of secrecy around it. As they travelled down along the bay, they passed Ulvsfjorden's mountains and they simply took his breath away. And Jan said, "I realise now, it would have been foolish. I would have been dead to try and cross those mountains." It wasn't as straightforward just going from Snorby down to Cowberry Bay. There were several coastal batteries patrolling the waters, including a German patrol ship and searchlights. And Alfred had to carefully navigate through these so as not to be spotted, keeping as close to the shoreline as possible. In the event that they did get rumbled, Jan could simply just jump overboard and swim to the shoreline and scamper away. Everything went smoothly and they arrived at Cowberry Bay safe and sound, where they said adieu to Jan and then went on their merry way back home. Jan was now alone again, but he was confident that he could make his way to Sweden on ski from here. Everything was about to go disastrously wrong for Jan from this point on, and he was about to enter the greatest challenge he was to face yet, and ultimately a fight for survival and in the end rescue from ordinary civilian people. As Jan had entered the freezing cold Arctic water several times previously, his watch had stopped, so he wasn't aware of what time it was, and as he entered the little hamlet of Lyngseidet, he was shocked to come across a bunch of German troops returning from breakfast. The only thing was, he wasn't deterred. The brave man he was, he skied right through, shouting "Tracks!" as he went past. Not a single German soldier recognised the fact that he was wearing a Norwegian naval uniform. Next, Jan came to the village of Lyngseidet itself and a checkpoint that tried to stop him. Remember, Jan had no papers and he was wearing a uniform that had a Norwegian flag and the words Norway in English written on it. If he was stopped, he was a dead man. So as the German sentry tried to stop him, Jan turned quickly on his heels and skied up a little gully, and then he put the power on and started skiing really quickly. The German soldiers gave chase and supposedly started firing at him. We don't know if this is true or not, but maybe it is. In any event, this decision was to lead to disastrous results for Jan Bulstrud. Every decision Jan would make after this would be absolutely disastrous, wrong, and have serious consequences. On top of all of that, Mother Nature was pissed and she was about to deliver a serious blow to this commando on the run. So Jan was now entering the Lingen Alps, and these were notoriously dangerous and absolutely huge, the largest of them being Ykkavare at nearly 9,000 feet high. The weather started to change, but this didn't deter Jan. he found a riverbed which led down towards a glacier. This riverbed led to the glacier, which was south-southeast, and this was exactly the direction he wanted to go. It would take him to Sweden. Instead of going down, he had to climb, and as he climbed higher and higher and higher, up about 2,000 foot higher, this is where he encountered some seriously bad weather. Mother Nature had it in for him, and there was no going back. A blizzard started to rage, and vision got very, very, very blurry. The snow from the blizzard started cutting into his throat, and he gasped for air as he pressed forward. He couldn't see more than a few inches ahead of himself, so he started throwing snowballs to determine his position. Either side of him, steep mountains with jagged peaks and glaciers lay before him. So as the wind was cutting into his flesh and he had nowhere to go, he decided I'd best descend. But instead of descending, he continued ascending. And as he came to the edge of the glacier, he found Lyngstallens Valley was 450 feet below him. Carefully he made his way down to the valley floor, but the storm was relentless and raged in fury. He was absolutely shattered and exhausted. He had lost all sense of bearings and awareness, hadn't a clue where he was, and he still continued to throw these snowballs, still thinking that he was descending instead of ascending. Now completely disoriented and exhausted, he trudged on through the fog and snow, but he had absolutely no idea where he was. His wounded foot ached, and he had to sidestep on his skis, defeating both their purpose and usefulness. As he reached the precipice of the mountain, his eyes were frozen shut, and suddenly loose ice and dirt and snow broke free below him, moving down the mountain slowly at first, but then crashing madly, carrying Jan with it. From this, there was no escape. The roaring avalanche was absolutely deafening, ear-shattering, carrying Jan downhill 300 foot to the bottom of the valley, shattering everything that he had, leaving only his head and one arm free. So as I said, his food was all gone, the satchel was buried in the avalanche, his skis were absolutely smashed and also buried under the avalanche. Ski poles were missing, and he had no water. Worse still, when he awoke, he was in agony. He was still snowblind, remember. He could only see a little bit out through his eyes. It was like squinting, and he could barely see a light. This was the point where he decided that he couldn't give up. But it was also the point where he started wandering around delirious for days, hallucinating. Bullsrue wasn't to know it, but fate was about to gift him a guardian angel, despite Mother Nature's best efforts to kill him off. Jan Bullsrue would survive, but he would face many more challenges in the weeks ahead, including the self-amputation of 9 toes over several weeks with nothing but a blunt pocket knife and no painkillers. He began wandering around the base of Lyngstallen in the Alps, before following a small little brook he could hear just to his right below him. Remember, he couldn't see anything. When he reached the brook, hallucination began setting in. The voices of Per and the others came back to haunt him, and he seen himself as a cripple, while beginning to hear the screams of Erik and Sigurd as they were tortured back at Tromsø. All of this went on for 3 days before he came to what looked like a hut. Inside this hut he could see all of his comrades laughing and drinking by a warm fire, but they couldn't see or hear a crazed Jan scraping at the walls. There was no door to get in, and Jan began to despair. But finally, finding a latch, he lifted it and fell in the door of a real cabin, or at least that's what he thought. Hitting the floor face first, he had stumbled upon the Grönvall farm and safety. A startled and shocked Hannah Peterson was at dinner with her 2 sons, Johan and Ottar. Johan had actually opened the door because Jan was scratching on it, and this allowed Jan to stumble in, very much semi-conscious. Hannah sent Ottar, the youngest son, to fetch her brother, Marius Grönvall, Ottar's uncle, who lived with 2 other sisters and their mother in the house just opposite. Marius Grönvall was not only a farmer, he was a local journalist and a well-respected member of the community.
Marius was shocked at the sight of Jan, but knew exactly what to do. This man would be the reason Jan Bulsrud survived.
Find out in part 2 how local farmer Marius Grenvall organises and coordinates the most ambitious rescue operation of World War II.